Hi, I'm Shaf, and I run the community at NoCode Ops, and you've just tuned into one of our weekly live events. So, welcome everyone. And today's event is going to be somewhat of a two-part session where we'll first have somewhat of an interview with Courtney to kind of like get to know how his journey as a no-code up expert came to be. And the next half will be a personalized Airtable automation overview led by Courtney himself. And also, one thing to note for everyone is that you should feel free to use the chat feature on your right-hand panel to queue up your questions, and we'll get to it during the Q&A session at the end. Without further ado, I'd love to start off this conversation by having Courtney introduce himself. Courtney, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm in rainy Washington, D.C. right now, so it's a little bit darker than usual in my basement. But yeah, thank you for having me, and I'm happy to be here. Yeah, just a little bit of background on myself. I've been using NoCode Tools since kind of early release of Bubble and Airtable about 6 years ago. And so I used that to scale up companies before to reduce kind of overhead and staffing requirements and just provide a better overall experience to customers by automating a lot of things that would normally be more manual. So
Right. That's amazing. And what was your background like before you start this whole no-code journey?
before the
Deep.
whole no code. Well, I'm old, so in terms of no code. So my first no code tool was Dreamweaver, actually Dreamweaver 2 and 3 back when it was owned
Right.
by Macromedia, and that was in college. So I used to do a lot of front-end web development using Dreamweaver, and I was like, man, like why hand code when you can pop up a website in a matter of hours with these tools? So from there, I got into home automation outside of college, doing custom control inside of homes. I've always kind of had this draw to automating things and gadgets and technology, and so I'm introducing it into my personal life for better or worse. You can ask my wife if it's helpful or not. So, but yeah, I'm happy to be here and looking forward to diving into this.
No, definitely. You mentioned Dreamweaver. Like, what are some of the no-code tools that are basically your power tools or in your tech stack currently, though? Are you still using
I mean,
Dreamweaver? To be quite honest, I
no,
have not heard of Dreamweaver. I've heard people like mentioning it in the past, but have not really, dabbled into it. But I'm not even sure if it's still around. But yeah, would
yeah,
love to know
I
what.
don't actually think it is. But yeah, I stopped using it at Dreamweaver 3. And that was still
Mm,
when Adobe had not bought Macromedia yet. But in terms of like my foundation, Airtable's one of the biggest ones. I use Process Street quite a bit for a lot of process kind of control and automation. For kind of more creative projects, I've just recently started using Framer sites for my front end. So my website is not fully built out yet, but I'm really excited about Framer. But Zapier, Integromat / Make now are powerhouses for me. Um, yeah, those are the big ones. And Twilio has a lot of products that I use. SendGrid. Um,
right.
yeah, I mean, you don't want to see my
Oh.
open tabs. It's basically every no code tool there is.
Yeah, no, pretty much the same as me because, we're discovering new tools every single week or at times every single day. So it's just kind of nice to see where people are at in their journey in discovering no code tools in general. So yeah, thank you so
Yeah,
much for sharing that. But um, I'd love for you to kind of like get started on what you have in store for
sure.
us today. Because I am honestly very excited, as you might have already known us going through this conversation last week. But yeah, go for it. The
Yeah.
stage is all yours.
So before we get started, I'm going to preface all of this with saying there's no perfect way to do anything. It really depends on your use case and what you're trying to accomplish. There are easier ways to do things. There are more complex ways to do things. So this is just kind of a culmination of a lot of the things that I've, uh, you know, done over the years in terms of formulas. And now with Airtable automations, there's a lot of things that you can do without having to rely on kind of outside platforms like Zapier and Integromat. So just going to do a quick, overview. So My name is Courtney Baker. I focus on no-code biz ops. I'm trying to branch out to be more of a maker of custom products and product development. But you can follow me on Twitter at Courtney Baker or email at Courtney@sprocket.one. Briefly mentioned this already. Airtable Automations is kind of an internal tool within Airtable to let you use the data within the base to complete certain, I would say, simple actions right now. And there's some limitations of this, which we'll go over, but essentially it'll allow you to run certain workflows through their automation platform to create records, update records, maybe send messages outside of Airtable to certain tools. So that's what we're going to be jumping into. Here's just a quick overview of the current action triggers and actions. So in any kind of automation platform, you're going to have a trigger, which is what starts the thing, and then an action, and what happens when that trigger happens, right? So these are relatively basic, but I will point out that this incoming kind of webhook trigger is relatively new, and it can be really powerful. So we'll be using this in kind of our more advanced workflow walkthrough. And then on the action side, you can do a lot of things like sending messages either via email or Slack. There's some Google products in there, and then your typical kind of Jira and other things. So here's where I'm actually going to jump in and do a quick automation that we'll dive into later. But you can see my screen, and if you are fans of The Office like I am, this entire base is Dunder Mifflin themed. And so this is going to be a trigger that I'm going to send to the Sprocket1 Twitter account with a tweet based on this form being submitted. So this isn't fancy, but this will give you an idea of some of the simple actions that you can take. There's all kinds of other ways you can interact with your Twitter feed besides just submitting, a form record. So we're going to submit this, and then almost instantaneously, we will probably here we go. So this is the tweet that just went out with the link, and that is our first automation. So jump back here. Current limitations besides just the triggers and actions. The number of tasks is likely to be, or is limited by the account level that you have. So the pro plan, I think, is like 50,000 tasks or, automation runs. Are we okay with the audio or? Okay. Which is quite a lot, right? If you're trying to run an enterprise level business, then 50,000 probably isn't going to be a lot, but for $20 a month per user for the pro plan, you can get quite a lot out of that. In my opinion, the biggest limitation is this 25 automations per base limit. And so there's some things that I can show you in the later parts of this where you can be a little bit more efficient or double down on some of the triggers that you use to make sure that you kind of fit under that 25 automation limit per base. Almost everything is real time, but if you are relying on formulas that include dates, or formulas that have like now or today within them, then you don't want them to be so granular that you're trying to get them to trigger every 5 or 10 minutes. So a good example would be if you need to send out a notification based on a day, like today, then that's fine. But if you're trying to send out an event reminder within 5 minutes of the event starting, then that's not likely going to work very well, or you could run into some problems. So, and then kind of the other big one is any reformatting of data you have to do within Airtable. So if you want a different date type or date style, you need to have that as a field in Airtable that you're going to pull from. So it doesn't have the kind of formatting that Zapier and Integromat allow you to do while the automation is running. As with everything, your Airtable base, whether you're a beginner or expert, you need to put some thought into how to properly design it, set it up, and kind of format everything. So while the base that I'm about to show you is not a perfect example of that, I will go over best practices on how to set up a proper database. But I always start with paper. If there's something that I want to kind of think through, I think through of like what different types of data or events or other things that need to be kind of put in their own tables. What do those records look like? What do the fields for each record type look like? And so you'll kind of see from this how I've structured things. You'll get a pretty good idea about how like to set up like a decent CRM system or like a project management system or even kind of tracking finances. So those are some of the use cases that we're going to go through. So to get started, we've already seen the one where we're submitting a form, but we're just going to walk through two kind of simple ones. And I don't know if we're there yet. I think we are. The first one is going to be send a weekly digest email. And so this should have exactly. All right. So just to go back over the Airtable base right now, what I have in here is kind of a mismatch of different use cases for like, let's say an office, but you're going to have your people table. Maybe there's some events that you want to add that are kind of not tied to any kind of project. There's going to be a project level table where there's a larger, a project lead involved and maybe some other things or other people involved. There's going to be some tasks associated with those projects. And then we're going to track some financial stuff. And then here's a little bit of some documentation that I put together for the automations. So right now, this is just simple event table. Anybody can add a new event. You can automate some of the creation of these things, which we've done. But essentially, this first automation is going to be send a weekly digest of all events at a certain day and time. So this, in the documentation, this is Sunday, but for the purposes of this event, I've set up the trigger here that at a scheduled time. So every Wednesday, every 1 week on Wednesday at 12:15, starting, in the past, I want to find all the events. So the events table here, where the conditions where it's meeting a certain criteria, the records are meeting a certain criteria, where the event day is within the path or the next number of days, right? So we're going to send an email out that says, in the next 2 weeks, these are all the events that you have scheduled. And then this email is going to go out that says, these events starting in the next 2 weeks. And then this is going to show you what that data is. So we scheduled that to go out at 12:15. And then here's an email that says there's 0 events scheduled because I forgot to update the number or the event dates in here. Oh, wait, sorry. The next 2 weeks, find all records. All right, so we'll just test this again. I think I turned this on a little too late. What did I say? You know what? I totally screwed this up. Well, it did go out. I don't know. I found it did not find any records, but I will just skip ahead. Hopefully you guys get a good idea about why this happened, at least why the trigger and the automation that goes out. The next one is also very similar. So if there is someone's birthday for this trigger, so instead of the scheduling trigger being used, that we're going to look at the conditions of the records. specific records that if anyone's birth date is within 14 days, then we're going to send out a email or a Slack message just as a reminder that someone's birthday is coming up. And then there's also an automation, an additional action that we're going to add it to the Google Calendar. This might be kind of a throwaway use case, but if there's any kind of recurring item that you want to be reminded of within a certain period of time, or there's any other conditions that you need to match here, like in this trigger, that it's going to send out a Slack message. So let's do a quick test. And I have notifications turned off because of the I'm sorry, I have Slack turned off. So, and we will see that in this testing that Slack sent out a message that says Jim Halpert's birthday is on the 17th. I can move on to the next kind of automations. I know that we're not tight on time yet, but I want to keep going. But if anybody has any questions, please feel free to chime in. Shaf can kind of keep an eye on some of the relevance things that I'm going over right now. So another big one for project management is like when you create a new project, there's going to be a default set of tasks. So a good way to kind of do this is we're going to do a form submission that's going to kick off a new project. So, and that, there's some optional fields in here that if you want to add attachments, you can do that. So what this is going to do is that when you're creating when a new project is created, you're going to run 4 default actions. So we're going to create records. So you have your project level, and then you have your task level. So there's going to be automatically create 4 default tasks when this project is created. So let's just go ahead and add this real quick. And we'll back out. And then we'll come here, and you can see here on the timestamp that today at 12:23, this was created. So if we go into our tasks, we can see sorry, let me find Kelly. Yeah, so here we go. So this project, which we deem NoCode Ops, is here. And then why don't we just set this up real quick? We're going to say we want to look up the project lead. So then Kelly's in there. So now that this project has been submitted, we basically created these 4 planning stage records, right? And once these are complete, you can set up different views and automations that you can use checkmark, or you can use a status change to get those out of there. The second part of this automation is actually going to be that once a project reaches a certain phase, then it's going to create 3 more default tasks. Now, the way I did this was for the first one, this is based on a record creation. We've already gone over the trigger being meeting a certain condition, but this next one is actually going to be based on a view. So I want to stop here and say, if you have automation that you want to set up different filters for, or it could have a lot of conflicting information, but it has one kind of one piece of information that's kind of similar, then maybe setting it up in a view where the view is filtered is better than setting the specific conditions of a record. So if you're looking to find like one or maybe like a small amount of records, maybe set up the filter up to to the conditional so that it's based on the conditions. But if it's a much larger group of or pool of records, then maybe setting up as a view is better off. So when the project view, when the record enters project view started, we're going to create these 3 new tasks for that project. So I'll just go ahead and go back to projects. And then right now, this project for Kelly's project is a new. And if we switch this to started, then we'll go back to automations. And we'll see that this kicked off, this ran successfully, and these 3 records were created. And we can verify that back in the task table. So now we have original planning records in there, and now we have 3 new, what I'm calling building records. So now that the project has started, we're now building. Any questions so far? Why those come in? All right.
Feel free to use the comment section, everyone, to leave your questions. If not, I think we're good on questions so far, Courtney.
Okay. One other thing I want to point out here is also like Airtable is great at table management, but their automation management in terms of like structure and like rearranging things isn't great yet. So these automations are going to be in an order in which you create them. So it doesn't matter if you name them and they should be sorted, or right now there's no easy way to, put them in some specific order. So I want to jump back here and just point out that this is listed as an intermediate kind of automation, but it's a little bit more advanced just given the formulas that we're using. But if you have a good use case of this is if you have say an email drip campaign that you want to launch, right? And you want to customize messages, or you want to, maybe it's standardized messages that you want to go out. If there's a custom onboarding process that you want to use, this is where you can kind of save, be more efficient in the use of automations. And the reason I say that is instead of creating an automation for each, condition that this matches for the trigger, or creating a view, you could create a common trigger using some logic and formulas in your base that would basically be a trigger for those things. And I'll use kind of one of my favorites, which is switch, which is like the equivalent of nesting a lot of if statements, right? And so this trigger is common. So every time that this field here, people, when the review trigger is trigger, then we're going to do these actions only if those conditions are met. So these are conditional actions. There's some logic here, and all 3 of these are very different than each other. And that may be a little bit confusing, but I'll kind of show you what we're working with on this. So say you have a new customer and you want to send them emails 7 days after they started your service, and then 15 days after they started your service, and then 30 days after they started your service. Well, you can set up a trigger in here that, where you collect their start date. You're going to do a formula on how many days it's been since they started. And then you can kind of set up this review timing. All right. And so this will be part of the trigger that goes out. So for this example, I set up different kind of review triggers for each department. And the way that I did that was I created a switch, which it's basically, like I mentioned, a nested if statement. So if department equals accounting, do this. If admin, do this. If customer service, do this. So right here, what we've done is we've set up day intervals where we want that review trigger to do some action in the automation. So for accounting, it's every 14 days. For customer service, it's every 21. For executive, it's 7. And for sales, it's 7. All right. So I'm going to kind of do these one by one based on the automation. So we'll look at the conditions here. So before I trigger this, I'm going to walk through that if the department name contains sales and days since start is equal to or less than 70, then we're going to create a record in the events table. And it's just going to be simple onboarding message. The event date is going to be today. And then the person that event's going to be tied to is wherever this trigger came from. So, and then the event description is going to be, arbitrary. A really good use of this is if you want to do a lot of internal automation without relying on outside platforms like, Zapier and Integromat, that's great. But if you want more advanced workflows, you can set this to trigger Zapier or Integromat based on a new record being created. And so in that event table, you would have all the fields of the information that you would need to carry out that integration. And so for this one, we're going to see for the people that match this criteria, and this is going to be sales. So come down to sales and let's see, Phyllis or Jim. Jim started on, right now he's at 69 days. We'll put him back and we'll trigger him on 70. And then Phyllis started at 62, so we'll put her back 1. And all right, so now you can see that both of those triggered. And we too have 2 successful runs. So Jim Halpert was at 70 days, so he triggered, and then Phyllis was the other one. All right, so if we go back to our events table, we will now see that Jim Halpert and Phyllis have new records here for onboarding message. And the reason I did this is I added another switch based on this event type that for certain event types, we want to invoke some sort of outside platform. Well, what if you're using multiple, like a lot of people in NoCode do? They'll use Zapier for certain things and Integromat for certain things. Well, you could set up a trigger or a filter that says, watch all new events and only trigger when it says Zapier, right? So if Zapier is only going to pick up these events and then maybe make an Integromat only pick up the other events if on their platform. So a little convoluted, but like you can think of every client that I've worked with is like, oh, what if we did this? And like, it just takes a lot of like stepping back and being like, all right, well, that's possible. Let's try to find out the simplest way to do that. So using switch is often a really good way to get around very complex nested if statements. And I don't necessarily have to go through all of the rest of these, but you can see that, the other, the follow-on conditionals are otherwise if the department, contains accounting, then send out a Slack message. And then here's a kind of a quirky one that if department name contains executive, which right now Michael Scott, president, CEO, whatever, president, branch manager, is the only executive. If his event count is less than or equal to 1, then send a message to Jan saying Michael isn't working enough, right? And so there's all kinds of other formulas that you can do using count, formula, lookup tables, all kinds of things that you can trigger these things. Let's see. And then the last one I kind of wanted to walk through is, before we kind of get into the pro tips, is this. It's a little bit more advanced. Webhooks are amazing things that people get really scared of when they hear that word. But I'm just going to walk through kind of a Stripe lookup that I have webhook that I have that I thought was really cool, that this would give you a really good idea of like how to instantly trigger certain things based on whatever information is in that webhook. The best way I like to describe webhooks is, imagine that you're expecting a package to be delivered to your house. Well, a lot of the older automation tools would do what is called, I say older, a lot more moving towards webhooks, but this is still in practice, but it's polling, right? So every 15 minutes, like Zapier has different plans that things will be triggered at 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 15 minutes. So that's the polling rate. So imagine that you're expecting a new package and you check the front door every 15 minutes to see if the package has arrived. Well, a webhook is like the delivery person ringing a doorbell when the package has arrived. Is that as soon as that webhook is triggered, then you know that data is ready to be sent. So that's like the easiest analogy that I could come up with, that instead of checking every so often to see if it's there, that you're notified that it's, everything is ready. So this is for incoming webhooks. So the way this is set up is that when a webhook is received, you're going to get a URL or a link that you're going to use in whatever platform is going to notify this URL or notify Airtable. So in this case, I've taken this URL from the webhook from Airtable and I put it into Stripe. Now Stripe, I won't go into all the details of how this works, but essentially if you go into the developer side of things, you can add a webhook. And when you add that webhook, it says, what things do you want to be notified from our platform when we send this information to webhook? And so for this automation, we're going to look at when an invoice is created, I want to be notified. And when an invoice is paid, I want to be notified. And what we're going to do is, when we create this invoice that I've mocked up here, it's going to create a new record in Airtable. Here. So we're going to see NoCode Ops as the record name. It's going to be automatically assigned the record ID. It's going to should pull in the payer email here. And then it's going to say payment status is invoiced, the amount the invoice is for. Well, we won't worry about this. And then it's going to give us an invoice ID from Stripe's platform. And then what I'm doing here is I'm watching to see when the status of this payment status has changed. And then this is empty right now, but when we pay the invoice, it should update this to paid and it will give us a payment ID. So why don't we give this a shot? I've tested this a number of times and now would be the time for it to stop working. So we're going to review the invoice and then we're going to send it. It's going to trigger that webhook. Oh, there we got it. We got it right before I changed tab. So NoCode Ops, Airtable number 1, the email, everything's in there, right? So now we're going to go pay that invoice and it's going to update as soon as I get the email. All right, so we got the email and I'm not paying myself $800. This is in testing mode. So anytime you're working with Stripe, make sure you're in test mode and that way you're not using real money. So we have all the details of the invoice. So I'm going to go ahead and pay this invoice. And since it's in test mode, all I have to do is put in this dummy data, which is already input for me. And I can look at the invoice details if I want, and then I'll just hit pay. And hopefully this right here is going to shift to paid. Right there we go. And that's automatically, and then we capture the payment ID. Now, I can go into a little bit more detail about why you would want to do this. I mean, Stripe has a very robust reporting platform, but it can be overly complicated. So if you're not a financial wizard and you want to kind of keep track of payments, and you can send customer reminders this way by saying like, hey, this has been at this date for 7 days. So like, let's say this date payment status changed is a modified date modified table or field. So this, you can't edit this. This is only going to see when this field changes in this record. So if you wanted to set up reminders or something else that goes out saying like this is still invoiced and not paid based on it being 7 days past the last modified date, you could do that. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the automations. Please let me know if you have any questions. If not, I'm going to go through some of the kind of the best practices that I've learned, in addition to documenting your work, which you definitely want to do, especially if you're working with other people. Everybody kind of, maybe it's just me, not everybody, can get overwhelmed by how complex things can get. So you want to make sure that you remember. And if you're sleep deprived and have 2 kids or just don't sleep, you're going to forget stuff. So setting up a simple way to document things like the automation name, for the sake of this exercise, I've classified them, what level they are, kind of the description, what kind of trigger is used in it. And then, I can add a multi-select field for any of the actions that are taken. So I say like, in this one, we use Slack and Gmail or things like that. With an Airtable, it's good. Sorry, go.
Yeah, no, we actually have 2 questions. If you want to take that, let's do
So
it.
how does
Okay,
it?
I'm going to
Yeah,
that to you.
yeah. So tell
Okay,
me.
so
Go ahead, Chef.
Adam asked if you trigger based on a view in Airtable, how often does the automation fire?
So Zapier used to do it only once, and I believe Airtable does the same thing. So if you back out of a view and then you put it back in the view, I believe it does not trigger again. But what you can do instead of that is you can use the updated trigger. So when a record is updated, and for this, you need, well, let's just do financials. That date modified field. And this is kind of how Zapier and Integromat work as well. So it's going to trigger every time a certain change is made in a status of a field, right? So you could put in a new date, or you could put in a new status. But anytime there's an update to that record watching that specific field, then you could have it triggered. So yeah, I understand why Zapier and Integromat kind of got away from using Vue as a trigger, because people were getting frustrated, and it's probably not best practice to always dump records into a view, especially if you intend on them coming back out of that view. So views, from my perspective, are great for for grouping, but also if people are following a very linear path where you don't have to back them back through that or backdate or things like that. So.
Good. And our next question is from Tommy. He asked, how does Airtable handle failures with webhooks? Does it stop completely, or does it queue the unprocessed ones?
That is a good question. I didn't put that in the documentation. I just read something, and I'll have to find it, But it will retry, I believe, up to a certain point. But I don't know at what frequency and then how many how many retries before failure. So I'll have to look at that. I think they might mention it in the Webhook documentation. So yeah, I'm sorry. I'll have to look that up. I don't want to misspeak and say it's for sure like this many times before it fails and what happens after that. But yeah, I would say it's a new feature. If you test it and you're using a webhook platform like that's pretty reliable, then it would be reliable. But if it's like a newer product, I've run into some issues in the past where their system got kind of backed up and, webhook queue just like filled up, right? For like a form response or something. So if it's a newer platform that's not well vetted or they're making changes to their kind of infrastructure, I would try to avoid using this reliably until I think there's a way to re-trigger things that are in a queue, but unfortunately I didn't set that up where there's a failure or like a backlog for this particular scenario.
No problem. We'll get back to you on that, Tommy.
Yeah. All right. Um, if you're also using Airtable a lot, it's funny, they released a feature about being able to edit records, and then they retracted that launch. I think this happened yesterday or the day before. But ahead of that, if you're using forms to add a lot of information to Airtable, there's not a way to add or edit records using a form unless you're using an outside source like Zapier or Integromat. To get around this, what I've done is if you have forms with linked records in them, and that linked record, say like you want to add a new contact, and part of that contact is that they work at a certain company, and you have a table with all the company names. Well, you can't link that person to a company if it doesn't exist. And so what I've done with a lot of these forms is that, let's see, for this create new event, well, there's a person that's supposed to be associated with this. And so if I come back to people, I want to add a person, what I'll do is I'll copy the add a person form. If this is something I don't want people diving into the actual database to do, then I'll say needs a person. And when you open this, if the person's not available, let's say Ryan, who's not in the list. Well, he's not in here and I can't add him from a form. Well, if I say, I don't even know Ryan's last name. Anybody in the chat know Ryan from the office's last name? Let's see. Temp. Yep, there we go. So I'll go back and fix that later. All right, so now that we have Ryan in as a person, I should be able to find him. There we go. And let's just say I have this event date. And now I can add this. So this goes into Airtable. And the reason I set up this kind of form links table is that if you're using this out in the field quite a bit on your phone, mobile, those apps don't allow you to really easily get in and change certain things. And so if you just want to add a record, I've done this in the past where I will create a shared view of this page where it's not public, but I'll take this and I'll say on my iPhone, I'll create a shortcut that launches this link. right? So it's almost like a bookmark. So it launches this link, and then I get this table, and I'll have all the links of all the things that I would want to add into this Airtable base, right? And then if some of them are password protected and I don't want to share that, I could hide this notes thing here for this particular view, and then people would know whether or not they're password protected. So yeah, just sharing this view of all the links is something that I use quite a bit. I thought was pretty handy. How much? We have about 10 minutes. So, I mean, if anybody has any other questions, let me know. But I'm just going to kind of hopefully go through all these kind of pro tips that I've looked at over or kind of accumulated over the years. Touched a little bit on managing views. A great way to do this is think about your process from like top down, or however you want to kind of segment and group things, that you can now create new sections with views in them. So it could be functional area. It could be like an onboarding flow where you want to set up a view that says onboarding, and each view maybe has like, it's numbered, right? Like new inquiry, application accepted is number 2, payment made is number 3, right? And then they go on into another group that says like, account setup complete or whatever it is. So that's a great way to kind of think about views. If there are automations tied to specific views, then I will set those, and it's in a little table, and usually I'll do like a robot emoji to signify that there's an automation associated with that filtered view. There's also ways to kind of lock views so that people can't change them, especially if they're tied to an automation. You don't want people going in and changing the filters. A naming standard is very, very helpful. I'm very guilty of not doing this, and it's something I kind of learned, like pay tuition on, is coming up with a very common way of managing views. Airtable's doing a little bit better job of like helping to manage your fields, but in terms of finding views, if you're in a table with 50 plus fields, you're going to have to scroll through a really long list. But what you can do is, we'll find a better table to do this on. You could say, I want to just type through, and I want to see all the things that say review. You can do that. So with a proper naming function, like if it's a lookup field, you could add lookup to the name, either beginning or end, for linked records, for rollups, for counts, for certain outputs. You could classify those, or even functional areas. So like say it's something specific to accounting, right? You could find some sort of naming standard for all the accounting related fields. Kind of already gone over documentation. Also pay tuition on not keeping things clean. And I think this goes back to proper documentation, adding descriptions for your tables and things, and then going back through and figuring out a good way to clean up after yourself if those things are no longer used. So oftentimes if I'm working with someone else, I'll go change the description to like of something that I don't think that we need anymore, and I'll just mark it as like, deprecated or something. And then after a certain period of time, I'll get rid of that. And another good way to keep track of how long it's been since you've used something is to set up date modified fields, to see the last time a change was made into any record in that field. Another good one, I think, is kind of breaking your more complex formulas down into smaller chunks, especially if you have like if statements, if you're trying to do stuff with dates. Take each function, right, each thing that you're trying to do, and do one piece at a time. So a good example of this might be, I want to find the date of an event, and then I want to, let's say that date has a certain time to it. Well, I want to make sure that that time zone is for New York. So I'll find the date, and then I'll add on the time zone function, right? And I'll make sure that works. And you can do this by creating multiple fields depending on how complex that is. But like, let's say there's 4 functions that you want to do. You have the one that you want, and then you start with the smallest piece, make sure it works, and then you add on that next piece, and you make sure that works, and then finally like the third or fourth piece, and then you consolidate all that formula back into the one that you want to complete. Another really helpful thing here is, you can't really see it in this, but using a code editor or like an IDE, you can actually like do your spacing and tabbing to make sure that all your arguments line up the right way. So this is actually an example from Airtable, but here's kind of some links to some code editors and IDEs that I've played around with. I use Atom a lot. It's pretty simple, but it'll help you kind of make sure that your formulas make sense, and you can see the formatting. The other thing is, when you copy and paste that formatting into Airtable, it looks all screwed up. But if you copy it out of Airtable and back into a code editor, it should still stay formatted the right way. Yeah, when you're making changes to relevant automations or making changes to formulas that are involved in automations, make sure to turn them off. We touched on locking fields and views that trigger automations. Another thing that people get hung up on and spend a lot of time trying to figure out why it's not working is that lookups they return nested arrays. So if you're trying to do things with dates in a lookup field, it can get pretty complicated. So what you have to do a lot of the times is you have to add another field and concatenate the lookup so that what it does, or you can do, if it's only returning one item, then you can do like array join, which basically takes all the nesting out of that lookup field. Date time formulas. Yeah, sorry. I need to come back and fix this one. This one needed a little bit more clear. Yes, another one is select fields. So single select or multi-select are returned as text. So if you use numbers or dates in your single select or multi-select fields, they are returned as text. So if you're trying to perform math operations on, like, say, like a single select that says 1 or 2 or 3, then it's not going to compute the right way. And especially if you use this in like any kind of automation, it's going to break. When using outside operations, check fields or checkmark fields aren't great, because say you are sending a new record to Zapier or Integromat, and there is a checkbox field that is unchecked. A lot of times, and most times, I think Zapier will not return that field output, or Airtable will not push that field output to Zapier for them to look at. So let's say you only want to see the projects that have not been completed yet, and you're using a checkbox to determine if they're complete or not. Well, Zapier will not pick up those records because the field is essentially null. And so what you should do is say complete or incomplete or like past due or something else in a single select or multi-select field instead. Are we past our time, Chef?
We are actually at the top of the hour, but if you want to just like skim through the rest of the notes that you have, that'd be great, because we also have another question in the queue.
Okay, cool. Well, this last one, I've already gone over Switch. There's some formatting things that you can do with line breaks. And the last one is Slack notifications. So currently, Airtable has built-in Slack notifications. I've pulled this up here. Basically, we go to the information tab, and here you can set up these Slack notifications. The filtering options aren't amazing. You can set a view where you want to filter things, but I find that it can get overwhelming if you turn it on for any updates to records, then like all activity or updates to watch records, those are usually a little bit overwhelming, because then you're going to get an update every time a single change is made. But if you limit it to records in a specific view, I feel like that's much more manageable. So, so yeah, that's it.
Perfect. And our question is from Tommy, and he says, maybe slightly out of scope, but do you, Courtney, do a lot of script code on Airtable? I've been thinking what's the best way to version control that stuff. There's no native support on anything like Git, but it pains me to only have my code in some tool and not retain the history of changes.
Yeah, I don't do a lot of script code. I like the scripting table, and I mean something that I'm getting in more into. But what I do is I mentioned using a code editor. Um, I do have some very rudimentary like version control. So if I use HTML emails in my automations, or I'm doing different formulas, I will document those inside like Atom. I'll save a file and I have a file structure that kind of like lets me retain. I think you could push those things to Git, and do some things that way. But yeah, I don't know why Git would not work for like Airtable scripting. Um, I mean, I know like pushing, I would say in terms of like a repository, I don't know why it wouldn't work, but like pushing out code, like, no, Airtable doesn't have a great way to do version control. And I mean, there is ways to save instances, but that's only for kind of like data integrity and kind of like making sure you don't lose like all the information in your base. I imagine they're going to build it out at some point. I don't know that it's a priority, just because um, I think their focus more is on like expanding like more of the true no code audience. But I don't have any inside knowledge. I could be wrong that that's coming out. So
Perfect. And he says
uh,
that he would want to continue this conversation over
uh,
Slack. So that's
sounds good.
they no code off. But I think that's all we have today, right? Courtney, do you have anything or final remarks that you want to share with everyone here?
No, I appreciate everybody joining. Thanks for all the questions. I hope it was helpful. Maybe my next Airtable based session will be Ted Lasso or maybe Star Wars themed. I'll take some requests. So, but
Yes.
yeah, please feel free to reach out, ask any questions about Airtable. I mean, we didn't really go over it, but I think there's multiple sessions to be done on like proper database design. I think a lot of people, even though they're very smart, I think get hung up on things like junction tables and like what they're good for, and like or what a junction table is and why you should use it.
No, 100%. We're definitely going to have more of these sessions. And as Courtney mentioned, you can definitely reach out to him. And Courtney, where is the best place for people to reach out to you? If you don't mind sharing that again.
Yeah, sorry, we actually didn't go through all these, but also we have the link to the space if people want to play around with it or try it out. You'll need to add your own integration, like authorization to Slack and Gmail and all that. But feel free to download it. Did you have that in the chat, Shaf? Or
No, I actually am going to post that when the recording does go
okay,
live. So you'll
gotcha.
have everyone here and everyone watching on the recording will have access to the Airtable base and you guys can play around with it.
Yeah, so Courtney at Sprocket1 to answer your question, and then Courtney Baker. I have a Sprocket1 account on Twitter. I think we have all of like 10 followers right now. So I may switch back to just promoting my own personal account to help people out.
Personal branding at its best.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
oh. But
yeah.
yeah, well, folks, I think that's all we have for today. Thank you to all who has tuned in, and hopefully you've had an insightful session and took something out of this to kind of like help you think about building your next internal automation using Airtable. So until next time, Have a great rest of your week, everyone. Thank you.